Synthetic turf playgrounds. Health experts are claiming they're making children sick. It follows reports of high chemical levels in the surface.
The agency is saying it's not so sure about the use of those recycled tires as a playground surface.
I wanted to remind you as a pediatrician, as I do to most audiences, to remind you what's different about kids. You know, the mantra in pediatrics, kids are not just little adults, they're different. And they really are, and in terms of environmental exposure, it's quite different. And these are some of the most important factors that make kids different, and the younger the kid, I think the more these come into play. So one is that they take in more of everything than adults. So for instance, infants breathe at about twice the rate as an adult. So if you put an infant on a blanket on these fields and there's a concentration of some gas on the ground, the infant's going to be exposed more relative to their size than the adult. Then there's this issue of unique windows of vulnerability, and we've learned this over and over. Children's brains and nervous systems particularly are developing rapidly, and there are unique windows where they are more susceptible to toxins. And we've seen this repeatedly with exposure during pregnancy or exposure to very young kids.
We know that children are vulnerable to these chemicals. They are more heavily exposed pound for pound. They're biologically more vulnerable. They don't have the ability to break the chemicals down and get rid of them. They, especially in early development, especially in fetal life and in the first couple of years after birth, there's a phenomenon that we pediatricians call windows of vulnerability, times of exquisite sensitivity. If a child is exposed to a toxic chemical at those points in time. And children have decades ahead of them. They have a long time in which to develop disease that may be triggered by early exposures.
We did that with lead and poisoned thousands of children for nearly 75 years.
We have to think about how exposures now might cause disease that has very long latency. When you think about kids and their exposure to toxins, you think about how it would get into their bodies. So the main routes have been breathing it in, and that's why some people have studied the levels of things like volatile organic compounds in the air. Contact, so either through mucous membranes like this mouth and stuff or eyes, or direct absorption through the skin, and the younger the kid, the greater the absorption. And then ingestion, if you put a toddler on these fields, they naturally put things in their mouth. So there is the potential for ingesting also.
Heavy metals are a problem with the fields. They don't break down ever. Things like lead, when it gets in your body, it stays there forever. Mercury stays there forever. The other metals that are there are never going to break down. And we know that at very low levels, that a heavy metal, if it gets into the child's body, will stay there. Will be there for the child's entire life.
I mentioned the issue of acute exposure and irritation and respiratory irritation, mucous membrane irritation, but the sort of more significant is some of these are cancer-causing compounds, and does chronic long-term exposure in kids who have those unique vulnerabilities put them at greater risk of cancer. Kids playing on them, they come up, a lot of black on them, which is the black carbon.
The material that's on the field, because the infill is put on top of the field, gets on children's shoes, they track them into schools, into cars, all over the place.
The reason we're really concerned about the artificial turf, both the plastic and the tire crumb, is because we are exposing our children to a concentrated soup of all kinds of toxins
that are skin and eye irritants. They have toxins that are actually carcinogenic, and they have toxins. They have too much zinc. It takes a lot of
zinc, lead, copper, chromium, and polyaromatic hydrocarbons or organic compounds that have toxicities, phthalates and phenols, black carbon.
Hexane, hexachlorophene are all coming off. Benzothioazoles are coming out.
This crumb rubber contains lots of stuff.
Some of which we don't know because the recipe, that part of the recipe is proprietary to the companies that are making these materials for other purposes.
It is ground up rubber tires with all its toxins and all its problems.
It's a hidden danger. You can look at a tire, boy, that tire looks great, it's fine. You don't know what's going on inside it. That's what makes it so dangerous.
Making tyres is an exercise in chemistry. They're made by heating a compound of ingredients: carbon black, sulfur, and rubber, plus antioxidants, activators, and accelerators.
The stuff in our tires, we call it rubber, but it's really not. Real rubber comes from trees. This stuff is a synthetic material made with petroleum.
So if you think about what makes up a tire, it's actually made up of a lot of different things. There's the rubber, but there's also oils. There are vulcanization agents, sulfides, and zinc oxides. And then there are fillers, materials like carbon black and silica.
And they're in there in varying degrees because each bag of infill is somewhat different, and there's not a standardization. And that's been shown pretty much by everybody who's studied it, that it varies a lot.
The rubber bits are full of metals.
Of the 10 that we found, 5 are things which are already known to cause cancer.
Children are exposed today to a whole series of chemicals that didn't even exist a generation or two ago.
We know that some of the plastics are endocrine disruptors. Endocrine disruptors are things that interfere with the control processes in the body. Endocrines determine the age of puberty, for example. They also determine growth rates for the brain and various other pieces. So anything that disrupts endocrines really disrupts the future of the entire child. Serious cancer risks and neurotoxicology risks and respiratory toxicity risks are present when you put it on a soccer field or an athletic field. You know there's a lot of carbon black, a lot of tires. There's thousands of tires go in to make one of these fields.
This is the most concentrated exposure to carbon black in particular, just one component of these fields, the carbon black in particular, that your children will ever receive, that anyone has ever received.
Which have definitely been shown to have health effects. The carbon nanotubes in terms of carcinogenicity and have been declared as carcinogens. There's other issues of concern with black carbon. Again, the neurodevelopmental one was the most interesting that was recently published from the group at Harvard.
The carbon black is of particular concern because it's at this very fine level, so it can really get into the body and cause a lot of damage.
Research and tests show that as tires get older, even if they've never been driven a mile, they begin to dry out.
Essentially it's drying out, yeah. It's becoming less elastic.
Even when the tire looks brand new.
We're very concerned about the turf gassing off what's called polyaromatic hydrocarbons. These are gaseous chemicals which are known to cause cancer.
They're going to off-gas very rapidly. The best data on off-gassing actually was done in Norway, where they could play inside. And they found that if they turned the ventilation off, that there was a whole variety of organic chemicals that came off. Most of them were toxic, but you don't have to be on it. You can be just sitting next to it. So those people who are living next to these fields, as they off-gas, these gases are being swept into their houses and around their houses, and we put them next to schools, they're swept into the schools. The more people that ran on the field, the more gases that came off of it. So they got higher and higher as they had more and more people playing or running around on these fields. So if we now have fields used from dawn to dusk, the field is just constantly off-gassing. So the fields, they'll be less stable as they get older. The fields absorb things that are present from the air. So if there's a toxin present from the air, they absorb and they concentrate it. Then when you play on the field, you release it. So the fields are active. They act like any waste dump. In fact, anything that gets on the field will be absorbed by it. As these fields age, they'll break down. In addition to gases coming off are fine particulates that you inhale. And that turns out to be a very dangerous health problem.
Heat is a very concerning issue to me on these fields.
The rubber tires, even if it's dyed, they get extremely hot. So they've been measured at 161 degrees when it's 90 degrees out. That's very difficult for children.
Cup of coffee, 140 degrees hot. I do that within 5 seconds. If this is 140 degrees, you can have a 3rd degree burn as a possibility. So it's no joke.
Pretty much anybody who's measured this has found this repeatedly. Whether it's a reporter who goes out and does it, or whether it's the University of Missouri that goes out and finds that the synthetic turf surface temperature is 173 degrees when it was 98 degrees on that day. New York City found the same thing. Connecticut found the same thing. California, EPA found the same thing. Clearly, these fields get much hotter, so there's issues of tolerating the heat and dehydration. There actually were even a couple of publications about burns from them in athletes through their, in a trainer actually, through the shoes.
Blistering burn. And they went back out and did average temperatures on one day, pretty high, and they found that, of course, the average and the high on artificial turf was dramatically higher than on regular grass.
California was launching a major study of artificial athletic fields.
Well, the worst case scenario for release of gases from like an artificial turf field would probably be the hottest weather.
Vidaire says the state's budget crisis delayed his department's ability to hire contractors to perform the study before the very hot months had ended.
So is it possible that because those studies got delayed, that they're not fully complete and you can't get a complete read?
At first, Vidaire had to check with his department's press spokesperson before answering.
Yeah, Sam, I'm not sure what you're...
Then he offered this.
But you're right, of course, unless we measure under these different...
We've done a very poor job of testing these chemicals to ascertain whether or not they're toxic. And then when it comes to the more specific question, what do we know about the impact that these chemicals might have on early childhood development? The answer is we have no information at all on about 80% of the chemicals, which is to say that every day our children, and that includes fetuses, infants, young children, are exposed to a whole suite of chemicals are of simply unknown toxicity, which I consider to be an inherently risky business.
Right now, I don't know what's in this stuff underneath me, but nor does the government, and that's not good enough.
These materials, it's important to know, were not made for this purpose. They were not made to be used by children. And there is nobody monitoring or regulating the effects on this soup of toxins on your children. Nobody. There are no guidelines. There are no regulations.
The whole design is a recipe for disaster.